Hi all, welcome back to our lecture on syllables and syllabification. Now that we've seen a few cases in which the application of some phonological rules can depend upon syllable structure, such as the application of voicing processes in Turkish or glottal stop insertion in German, and how syllabification can apply persistently when rules that can affect syllable structure are applied, we can concern ourselves a bit further with some questions of what types of syllable structures tend to be preferred cross-linguistically. So let's remember briefly that we're using the terms onset to mean segments that occur before the nucleus inside a syllable, and the term coda to refer to segments that occur after the nucleus inside the same syllable. Now, intuitively, one might have expected that syllables should be constructed symmetrically, so that languages would, in general, universally try to say, okay, if I have a nucleus, I'll try to put in an onset and a coda and make nice, well-formed syllables with segments on every side. But this turns out not to be the case. In fact, there is a very strong preference cross-linguistically that no language requires for syllables to have a coda segment, and there are no languages that forbid syllables from having onsets. So we saw in the German case of glottal stop insertion, this glottal stop insertion can essentially be described as a constraint requiring that all syllables have an onset. And if they don't already have a consonant available to be placed into the onset position, then the rule of glottal stop insertion provides an onset. So there are many languages that allow syllables of the shape consonant vowel and that require an onset. Onsets are necessary and don't allow codas at all. Conversely, there are languages that are a bit more generous in the sense that they allow syllables without onsets, so syllables simply of the shape vowel alone, but they still don't allow codas whatsoever. Those are languages like Pidonha and Cayuga. There are a good number of languages that require consonant vowel, that require onsets in all syllables, but also allow coda consonants to occur, languages like like Klamath, for instance. And then a great number of languages, including the well-known Indo-European languages, for the most part, allow both onsets and codas. So this observation lets us, in general, conclude that languages are happy to have onsets. They like for onsets to occur in syllables, and they dislike or maybe avoid codas. This is why we can sort of derive this effect in our universal syllabification rules by having the process of onset formation apply before coda formation, and then simply specifying which onsets are allowed or not allowed in the language. This description of syllable structures doesn't say anything further about complex onsets versus complex codas. There are certain languages that will avoid complex onsets and prefer for a coda to occur rather than making a complex onset, or there are languages that will prefer to make a complex onset rather than having any segments in the coda. But again, you have to look from language to language. Another difference is in terms of different types of phonological processes that affect onsets on the one hand, and processes that tend to affect coda, segments in codas on the other hand. So in general, rules that target segments in the onsets of syllables tend to make those sounds stronger. That is, they cause those sounds to undergo fortition. So the process of Spanish the application of fortition to the glide yeah in Spanish to make it into a palatal fricative or a palatal stop occurs at the beginning of a syllable. And similar processes can be seen diachronically, whereby, for instance, between Latin and Italian, a glide at the beginning of a syllable becomes a palato-alveolar affricate, j. And conversely, rules that tend to make sounds weaker occur in the coda position of a syllable. So for instance, in the Cockney dialect of English, an L in coda position of a syllable becomes a back unrounded mid-tense glide, So that we see we are changing an approximant into a glide. So that's becoming a sound that is more sonorant, having less constriction. And this can also be documented historically. So for instance, the Latin pronoun nos, there an S in the coda of the syllable becomes a glide in Italian, giving Italian noi. A further difference is that in fine articulatory details, we can also see this same sort of weakening versus strengthening distinction. That is, consonants in syllable onsets seem to be stronger than consonants in codas, even if this acoustically, this isn't so clear. In articulatory studies, this has been demonstrated. So for instance, in the study of Keating and others, 1999, there they found that there was greater contact between the tongue and the mouth when one segment was in the onset of a syllable, as opposed to when the same segment occurs in the coda of a syllable. And the same study also showed that onset consonants have a longer duration of constriction. So these articulatory facts, when we apply them diachronically, can also give us an explanation of why these fortition and lenition processes tend to arise. And then finally, there are a lot more phonological rules that tend to target coda segments as opposed to phonological processes that tend to target onset segments. Now we can turn to a further problem that we haven't yet addressed, namely the problem of what happens if the rules for forming onsets and codas in a language don't permit for a given consonant to be placed into a syllable at all. And there are two general strategies that can be applied when an unsyllabifiable consonant occurs. These two strategies are, first, the possibility is to add a vowel, that is to create another syllable so that the consonant can be attached to this new syllable. The second possibility is to delete the consonant, that is, remove the consonant that can't be attached to the syllable. Theoretically, we could also imagine that the consonant is just allowed to remain without being attached to a syllable, but in general, this option either does not occur at all or is only perhaps allowed at the very beginning or the very end of a word to have a sort of floating consonant that doesn't attach to any syllable whatsoever. We won't concern ourselves with that last option today. Instead, we'll just see cases of these first two possibilities that are more common. So an instance of the first type of repair, we might call this, of adding a vowel, is evident in Japanese, where we find instances of alternations between no vowel and the presence of a vowel. So here we find words that seem to contain a stem or root, either gak, so these are our allomorphs, either gak or gaku. And this word, which is involved in general with types of stones. So the root gak or gaku is involved in learning, whereas seik involves stones in some sense. And it can occur as either seik, or it has the other allomorph, seiki. In each of these cases, we have two allomorphs, an allomorph with a vowel at the end of the stem and an allomorph without a vowel at the end of the stem. In Junko Ito's analysis of these alternations, she proposes that the underlying forms of these roots don't contain the vowel, but they are to be distinguished by having a palatal consonant versus a non-palatal consonant. I can't write the superscript, maybe I can copy the superscript consonant here. No. We'll want to imagine that this J here is superscript and means that this velar stop is a palatal stop. So there would be this underlying contrast between palatal velars and non-palatalized velars. Now, an important thing to know about the syllable structure of Japanese is that coda consonants are generally very restricted. So a consonant can only occur in the coda if it has the same place of articulation as the following consonant, or the consonant is the uvular nasal. So in all of these cases, so for instance, in the first two examples in each row, we see there is a geminate consonant. So we have gakko and gakkai on the one hand, and seiken and seiki. Here in the word for soap, we see an instance of that uvular nasal at the end of the word. Also in the word seikitang for coal, we see that uvular nasal at the end of the word, or in gakumo, learning, there's a velar nasal at the end of a word. So those are the only types of coda constants that we find. So for instance, for describing the syllable structure of the word gakko, we will have two syllables, gak and ko. And if we describe the syllable structure of the word seiken, there, in that case, the first syllable consists of the sequence sik, and the second syllable contains the onset ka and has a uvular nasal at the end of the second syllable. So only in these cases in which there is the consonants sharing the same place of articulation across the syllable boundary between the coda and the onset, or if there is a uvular nasal at the end of a syllable. All right, now, after processes of syllabification apply, Ito hypothesizes that Japanese has the following rules. So one is that this underlying palatal, excuse me, this underlying palatalized velar stop becomes depalatalized before a velar stop. So in the case of deriving this word, seiken, the underlying representation would need to be seiken, seiken. Need to copy this uvular nasal over here once again. And to derive the surface form, seiken, once first syllabification will apply. And it will build these two syllables. So notice at this point, we have these two syllables, and this is still a palatalized velar, but then the process of depalatalization applies. Let's just call this depalatalization. And when depalatalization applies, now this palatalized velar stop in the first syllable becomes a normal velar. So so far, so good. The further step is to assume that when a consonant cannot be put into a syllable, cannot be parsed into a syllable by the rules of syllabification, then a vowel will be inserted. So, and there are two different epenthetic vowels, either the high back unrounded vowel, U, or the high front vowel, E, and it depends on whether the consonant immediately preceding it is plus front or not. So in this way, we can derive, for instance, the words seiki yu for petroleum versus, say, gakudo, school child, on the other hand. So beginning from the input gakudo, or gakdo, we see here, first, let's apply our syllable rules systematically. So first, we build the syllable nuclei, then when in onset formation, the ga here will be placed into the onset, the da will be placed into the onset, and onset kda is not allowed, so we can't add that. And in this case, then when we come to adding coda segments, the ka cannot be placed into the coda of this syllable because the onset of the following syllable doesn't share the same place of articulation. So at this point, the ka is stranded. So this is the output after syllabification. And I'll mark this ka with an apostrophe to indicate it as a non-syllabified consonant. Then the high vowel epenthesis process will apply here, and the result will be that then a new vowel will be inserted, an ö, and as we saw previously, then at this point, syllabification can apply once again, and a new syllable will be built around the vowel involving the new vowel ö that was inserted. And finally, in case the vowel e is inserted before a palatalized consonant, the last step is that the palatalized consonant that conditioned the epenthesis of the vowel e will itself then be depalatalized. So in this case, in the forms of, to be derived here, in the first column, because we have two underlying ka consonants, the output can simply be gak, kai, in terms of syllabification, without the need to insert any vowels. But in underlying gak ki, we expect the output gaku ki. Let's check it in our data here. We see that this is the word for tuition, the fees paid for attending a school. And that we obtain gaku ki in the same way that we obtain gaku do just above. When syllabification first applies, the ka here remains unsyllabified because it cannot be placed in the coda. Then the vowel u is epenthesized, and finally a new syllable is built. So that form will have the structure gaku i. And in the case of the word dai gak, the last word here for university, there again, this can apply also when the ka is at the end of a word. So the end of a word doesn't license the ka to occur in the coda of a syllable. The ka at first, after the first instance of application of the syllabification rules, the ka will remain unsyllabified. Then following vowel epenthesis, then vowel u will be inserted, and a new syllable will be constructed around that new plus syllabic segment. The depalatalization processes then come into play involving the root seikye. So here, when the kya, the palatalized ka, occurs before another ka, the ka is simply depalatalized and the syllable structure will be fine. So it will be, the derivation will be just like what we saw for seiking above. In the case of tan seik, there, the word for tan seik, gallstone. Here, first, after the first round of syllabification, the nasal there is allowed to occur in the coda of a syllable because it shares the same place of articulation with the following coronal sibilant fricative. So, but now the palatalized kya remains unsyllabified. When vowel epenthesis applies to that partially syllabified output, a vowel e will be inserted here, and a new syllable will be constructed around that new syllable nucleus. And finally, the last step would be that the palatalized velar stop would be depalatalized by the following e. Thereby giving us, we wanted to delete the palatal feature, thereby giving us the output tansaki, or tanseki rather. Should be an A throughout the form there. Okay, so now we've just seen that Japanese, in order to handle cases in which a consonant can be placed neither in a syllable onset nor in a syllable coda, inserts a vowel to create a new syllable to which that previously unsyllabifiable consonant can be attached, thereby rescuing the consonant. The other approach, as I mentioned, would be simply delete the unsyllabifiable consonant. And this alternative repair is sometimes called stray erasure in the literature. It's called that because on the printed page, it looks like the consonant is erased, and the consonant is referred to as stray because it doesn't belong to a syllable. And Harris's treatment of alternations between a consonant and nothing in Spanish are approached in this way. So in these examples, we see that there are some consonants that are sometimes present and sometimes not. So the verb absorber contains this ba in the infinitive form, but in abstract noun forms or the past participle forms, we find absorción and absorto, where this ba, which is present here, seems to disappear. And similarly, in other verbs such as fungir, we find fungir, but función, ungir, función, esculpir, and an agent noun, escultor, in which we see throughout alternations between some consonant and nothing. In order to, I think, explain the pattern that we can generally see is that the consonants occur, these stops, ba and ga, occur when there is a vowel immediately following. So here we see the infinitive suffixes er and ir, but if the following suffix begins with a consonant, as in sion, or por, or to, then the consonant disappears. So what we would need to assume here is both that, if we assume that Spanish generally disallows, since these all involve deletion of stops, disallows consonant plus stop codas, and it disallows, in all of these cases, the suffix begins with an obstruent, either a stop or an S, so those are obstruent consonants, and it disallows stop plus obstruent onsets. So in order to account for the data, so for instance, if we want to describe the syllabification of the infinitive form absorber, here we will have the underlying form. Here's our underlying representation. When this representation becomes syllabified, it can be syllabified as follows. So coda consonants are allowed, but certain types of complex codas, at least, are not allowed. So ab, sor, and ber are fine, and the underlying ba is realized because it's able to be placed in the onset of the syllable built around the nucleus A. But when the suffix sion is used instead, now initially syllabification, the first two syllables will be built exactly as before, and two syllables, probably, actually this should be written, the suffix is sion. We have a complex onset here of the same type that we saw earlier in the Spanish example with the word copia. We have a complex onset with an obstruent and a glide. And now we have the problem that this underlying ba is not permitted. So let's represent the two possible options here. It's not permitted to occur in the coda of this consonant. So absorption is illicit, and similarly to make a complex onset with absorption is equally disallowed. So at this point we have a stray consonant, an unsyllabified ba. And now the rule relevant for Spanish is simply that an unsyllabified consonant will be deleted. So in Spanish, syllabification rules apply, and then the rule of stray erasure, as we have termed this process of consonant deletion, will find any unsyllabified consonants and remove them, leaving only the syllables that were already, leaving only the consonants that had already been placed into syllables. Okay, so at this point, I think we can close our treatment of syllables for today. So the main thing that we've achieved today is that we have added some more structure, specifically what could be called prosodic structure to our phonological representations through the use of syllables. And as we've seen, as we mentioned, syllable structure is generally derived by rule through the application of steps of syllable formation, onset formation, coda formation, and syllable amplification is virtually never contrasted in any language. And those processes, those basic processes of syllable construction, onset formation, coda formation, are in their basic operation shared by essentially all languages. So when we're given underlying representations in an unknown language, we should be able to provide some possible syllabifications. We just have to then acquire some more information about precisely what types of onsets and codas are allowed in the language. But we can imagine some theoretical possibilities. And we've seen how these rules of syllabification can be used in derivation. So we saw how the processes of syllabification can be ordered with respect to other rules, and how syllabification tends to be persistent. That is, that syllable structures are built again after some rules apply that might especially insert vowels or delete vowels. And finally, in cases like the German and the Turkish cases we looked at, we saw how the processes of syllabification interact with other phonological domains. So recall that one good argument for the existence of syllables at all was the fact that we mentioned that there are many phonological processes that unite the environment, consonant, and word boundary. And we've said that this environment can simply be summarized as the edge of a syllable. In other words, the consonant, the last coda consonant in a syllable could be affected by a process. And we've also seen in those Turkish and German examples that depending upon the domain of syllabification, and in particular, whether syllabification can apply across the boundaries of morphosyntactic words, then that will affect whether other rules need to come into play, like vowel stop insertion in German at the beginning of a syllable, or voicing in Turkish of underlyingly unspecified obstruents before vowels at the beginning of a syllable. Okay, so that concludes our introduction to syllables and syllabification. These will become very important next week when we start to look at rules for the assignment of stress. Until then, take care.